ladies and gentlemen. The brief I was originally given for this session was to talk about the state of the world economy, the state of the US economy in the light of the possible election of Donald Trump, the future of Europe, the European Union, state of the UK economy, how things are going to develop post-Brexit, relate all that to the property market, and then I've just heard I'm also going to talk about the Airports Commission review. So it's quite fortunate that the organisers have given me 2 full hours to do that. So Guy, you might as well take a nap for a little while, because this could suggest you hunker down for the long haul. Actually, Brexit is very hard to talk about these days. It's become one of those subjects where your vocabulary is suspect, almost whatever you say. And so if you even hint that you might have the view that Brexit might cause 1 or 2 problems, you're immediately accused of subverting democracy and of being a Brexit denier. If you sort of complain a little bit that things are not happening as quickly as you might hope and there is uncertainty as a result, then you're cast as a Bremona. On the other hand, if you say that it's all pretty good, you're deemed to be a hard Brexiteer. If you're really enthusiastic about hard Brexit, you can be described as a pseudo-Brexitist. Actually, I made that one up, and I quite like it. But before we get into Brexit, let me take a bit of a run at where we are in the UK economy, and a few words on how the world looks. And it's a good moment to do so because, as you probably know, 10 days ago, there were the IMF meetings in Washington, where I was, where you listened to the Fed and the US Treasury and the IMF and the World Bank talking about how they see the world, and also have a long series of bilateral meetings with other bankers. It's a kind of speed dating for bankers at the IMF. You have sort of half-hour meetings one after another, but it is actually quite a useful opportunity to take the temperature. The main worry people had at the IMF was, of course, President Trump. And the general view I came back with was that we are quite fortunate that Trump has so many personal foibles. I suspect the women in the room might call them something other than foibles, but let's just stick to that. Because if that were not the case, it seems quite likely that we would in fact have President Trump. And that his brand of populism and protectionism and suspicion of immigration and a sense that America should look after its own and remove itself from many overseas entanglements, that brand of kind of populism, protectionism, isolationism is actually quite popular. And it's really potential President Trump's personal weaknesses that are likely to cause him to lose this election campaign. And we see also that strand of thinking elsewhere in Europe. We can see it in parts of Eastern Europe, maybe in Hungary in particular, but elsewhere too. I was in actually Romania yesterday, and they're very anxious. They've got an election coming up, and this kind of strand of thinking in Eastern Europe is quite strong. And maybe some elements of that into the Brexit debate, though there was much else going on in that debate, I think. And so many of the assumptions that we have made about popular support for free trade and open borders are now questioned. And I think that creates a rather nervous background, and we can see emerging from our new government here thoughts about managing capitalism, if you like, and managing trade, which would not have been part of the lexicon of conservative governments in the past. With that nervous background, what is going on in the world? Well, the US is growing at around 2% a year and forecast to continue to do so next year. The EU about 1.5% or a bit less. In fact, the differences between the two are not so great if you consider population growth in the United States. And you might say that this was not bad in the mature phase of a recovery, because the world economy has been in a recovery mode since we came back out of the crisis in 2009-10. But I don't take the view that this is satisfactory. because we have interest rates at close to zero, we have, of course, very low inflation, and we have oil at only $40 to $50 a barrel. And a few years ago, if you had told any economist that there would be very low inflation, zero interest rates, and oil at $40 to $50 a barrel, they'd have said, well, things will be steaming along, because that is all feet to the floor. But in fact, that is not happening. And we seem to have lost the art of above-trend growth with positive real interest rates. And this is a difficult environment, especially for the financial sector. I'm not here to plead the case of the Royal Bank of Scotland particularly this morning, but of course banks borrow short to lend long, and if the interest rate curve is flat, that trick doesn't work terribly well. And similarly, of course, for life insurers, there's not a lot they can offer savers in a zero interest rate environment. So that is a tricky environment. We've got very modest growth below what we would have considered to be trend growth in the past, yet with all the monetary indicators as green as they can be. And that creates one other worrying thought, which is, what if things go wrong? There is not a lot that the monetary authorities can do if growth slows further. And we've seen that here, that in response to the initial Brexit shock, the Bank of England acted, but it acted by putting rates down by 0.25%, from 0.5% to 0.25%. Well, that's not quite what you would have thought of as aggressive action in the past. So we're in a position where growth is modest. There seem quite a lot of risks on the horizon, of course, geopolitical risks with Russia, the Middle East, etc., and not much that the monetary authorities could do if growth slipped back. And I don't think that is a great place to be. But that, of course, is the sleepy old world. What about emerging markets? Well, there are some bright spots. Curiously, Romania is the fastest growing country in the EU, a trivial fact which you can amaze your friends with. But in many parts of the emerging markets, there are still some difficulties. Brazil is only just recovering. Russia is in negative territory, and they're forecast to pick up a bit next year. South Africa has a lot of problems. But I guess the most important ones are India, which is fine, about 7% growth. But even more important is China. Chinese growth is about 6%, and that's okay, but of course they were used to 10% for quite a long time. And if you look again at China growth, you'll find that it is now rather debt-fueled. I think the arguments point very closely to Heathrow, and indeed post-Brexit even more so, for a couple of reasons. One, we are supposed to be orienting our economy towards other non-European faster-growing markets, which in principle is a good thing. I've never quite understood why one excludes the other, but nonetheless we are supposed to be going for those markets, and that's what Heathrow's market is. And also on the tourism side, which I think would be quite significant in this scenario, Gatwick is basically an outbound tourist market. About 70% of tourists from Gatwick are going out. It may come as a disappointment to those of you who live in London, but not that many people in Marbella choose to spend their holidays in Hammersmith. And so this is basically an outbound airport, whereas at Heathrow it's the opposite. It's about 70% of the tourists who use Heathrow are inbound tourists, because they pull in tourists from the States, from Japan, from China, and that's their business. So, you know, if that's one of your concerns for the future, which is certainly one of mine, then I think it points to Heathrow. And many of the arguments against Heathrow, advanced by Gatwick and others, seem to me to be ones where they say, well, you can't do it because too many people will protest. Even if you think that the air quality issues can be dealt with, the noise issues, I think, can be significantly mitigated with the recommendations that we produced in our report. And I am very nervous about a situation which says we can't do stuff because people will protest. You know, we have a democracy in this country, and I think that what we should do is put this to the House of Commons and see what the vote is, and not take the view that we simply can't build a completely economically rational thing in an environmentally sensitive way simply because a few people will argue about it. You know, that doesn't seem to me to be a good way of making policy, and I think that is something which is very relevant to the property market. So a decision to do something other than Heathrow on grounds that Heathrow is just too difficult, I think would be quite a pessimistic message actually about infrastructure and indeed other development in this country. But I'll end there. Thank you.
Good morning. I think since the outcome of the referendum, most institutional property investors who look at the UK have really been facing this one big question. How will Brexit affect the UK property market? And I'm going to give you the answer today. Simple question, simple answer. I've been involved in real estate investment in the UK and in Europe for many years. I've seen property markets go up. I've seen property markets go down. Numerous boom and bust cycles. On an institutional basis, I started in the early 1980s at Goldman Sachs. In fact, in about 1984, I was put to work on establishing a futures market for property prices, along with a number of other investment banks. That was then followed by doing numerous property securitizations, shopping malls, Saks Fifth Avenues, and pubs, to name a few. Indeed, in 1995, after founding terra firma at Nomura, we purchased 1,800 pubs from Graham Met and Foster's, which we grew to a portfolio of nearly 9,000 pubs. At terra firma, over the last 20 years, we've conducted over 15 billion of real estate transactions, including one of the largest ever property residential transactions in the UK, which was the acquisition of 57,000 properties from the Ministry of Defence back in 1996, which formed Annington Homes. More recently, in 2014, we did the exit of Deutsche Annington, a portfolio of 180,000 residential homes in Germany, which proved to be one of our most successful investments.